Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Kassia and I spoke to Peter Frankopan, the historian at Oxford University and author of the smash hit The Silk Roads.
We were speaking to him at a live event in London, so once again, apologies for the audio quality. We began by talking to him just what it's like to be in the middle of a publishing phenomenon. The Silk Roads, his book that came out around 18 months ago now, has just really completely taken off. I think it's number 10 bestseller in around 10 different countries. We also spoke about the mechanics of actually getting a book like this published. It was a huge idea and initially put off some publishers, but he did eventually find an editor at a publishing house that was willing to work with him. And we also spoke to him about how exactly he got his agent, which rather strangely enough was at a charity auction.
We tried also to get to the bottom of just how many languages Peter Frankopan speaks, without complete success. At one stage, a lady in the audience asked a question in Bulgarian that he handled very smoothly. Sadly, we weren't recording at that stage. Our best guess is somewhere between 8 and 18 languages. But finally, and in some ways most interestingly for me, Peter also spoke very frankly about the anxiety that he experienced while he was doing this project, the completion anxiety, the sense it was too big, he couldn't finish it, also the role his wife played in supporting him during that period. And what that really drove home for me is that no matter what level you're at in the game, and he's clearly had huge success with this, that those usual fears don't go away.
Yeah, we loved recording this episode. He was a total charmer, so we hope you enjoy listening to it as much as we enjoyed recording it.
Peter, fantastic to have you here. We'd like to start a little bit just by asking, what made you become a historian? How did you get to choosing that?
Deep and meaningful.
It's an intense first question.
No, I loved history as a boy, but actually I didn't get to do history A-level.
Okay.
When I was at school, I fell in love with Russian, and particularly with Russian history. And I was very lucky that I went to school where I could learn Russian. And when it came to choosing my A-levels, I was really torn about where history fitted in, because that's what I loved most. But I did French and Russian and English, because English, I even realised then, you need to understand what writers are writing, and sometimes historians, without mentioning any names, can make mistakes of being over credible, particularly about sources from the past. That what people write is what happened, and life isn't quite so simple. And then I was even luckier that in my last year at school, my Russian teacher had gone out to Baghdad, I think possibly somewhere where they didn't serve too much alcohol, and he came back and taught a bunch of us, 4 or 5 of us, Arabic A-level in a year.
And he'd been in naval intelligence, is that right?
He'd been in naval intelligence, which is, as a teenage boy, is about as cool as a teacher can get.
Yeah.
So when he turned up in our Russian classes, he said, "Look, you guys, I'm not going to sit here and test you on vocab." And he treated us like grown-ups, in a way that actually teachers wouldn't be allowed to do today in the state sector or in the private sector, where you didn't care what the coursework, so you didn't worry about tests, you just wanted people to learn and ask questions. And he was sort of he was a very inspirational man, and so I owe a lot to him. So I then went to university. I went to Cambridge and studied languages, and I then went. It was the early 90s, and there was the breakup of Yugoslavia, and I rang up Norman Stone, who was a professor at Worcester College in Oxford, and I said, "Could I interview you to profile you for a piece about what the end of communism means, what's happening in Yugoslavia, what's likely to happen with Germany," because he was very close advising Margaret Thatcher at that time. And he said, "Look, come and have lunch." And I turned up for lunch, and he said, "Would you prefer red or white?" And before I could answer, he called the waiter and said, "Let's have one of each." and then about 3 hours later, I was only 20.
Yeah.
He said, how many words in Russian do you know for tomato? And I said, I don't know, 4? I could maybe guess at another one. And he said, "Do you think that's maybe a few too many?" And I said, what do you mean? He said, "Well, are you interested in linguistics?" And I said, "No, I'm interested in history." And he said, "Well, why don't you, if you speak these languages, why don't you study history?" And I was quite impressionable. I went back to my college. I went to go and see my language tutor, my Russian tutor. And I said, I'm thinking about maybe switching to history because I'm really interested in Russian history. And she kind of paused, looked at me and said, "You've had lunch with Norman Stone." And so I think that's how radicalisation happens.
Okay.
You speak to the right person at the right time who says the right thing. And actually, in my particular case, and everybody has their own different pathway, but that things have always going to happen at the right. Things have to happen at the right moment. Yeah. So I'm incredibly grateful that I learnt how to read Shakespeare. I learnt how to understand what poetry is all about. That made me a much, much better linguist by not doing history at A-level.
What was it that drew you to writing this specific book, which I hope you've all read, The Silk Roads? It is brilliant. I actually have to say I haven't read it. I listened to it on audiobook, which is 24 very glorious hours of being read to. But what was it that drew you into that?
Well, it was the same thing that drew me into my last book, and I sort of feel like a father of the books I've written, that everyone wants to talk about this one. The book I wrote before reconfigures how we should look at the Crusades, where that story of knights and shining armour and the Pope and Western interventions in the Middle East that don't go very well and end up in failure. The Crusades is almost the last thing that you should work out, you should learn lessons from that are bad. But there are all sorts of sources written in Greek, in Armenian, in the Caucasian languages, in Syriac and Arabic, that no one bothers to read, because the main story of the Crusade is all about how the West is powerful and piety and knights and violence is all great, because a Orlando Bloom-looking guy on a white horse looks great, right? And so it's the same process of trying to see what is not what do people think about something. It's where is the evidence? What are the materials? How can you step back and look at the same kinds of questions in a different sort of way? And I think The Silk Roads is definitely a sibling to the book I wrote on the Crusades, because it's trying to say that there is a different centre of gravity, that all those relentless books that are saying the same kind of thing, that there is a different way of looking at it. And it's not a polemical work. Silk Roads isn't trying to settle scores. It's not trying to sort of, it's just trying to say this is what materials there are that are available. And for most people, it's all brand new, because people don't know who are the great Arabic writers or the great Persian poets. People don't really think about what role Asia played in the origins of the First World War, because we know what happens in the First World War. Some fat guy in Sarajevo gets shot, and then the Germans cause it all, obviously, and then Britain rides to everyone's defence and save everybody. That's the story of the First World War. And like all stories that are idées reçues, that everyone says again and again, like the Crusades, not only is it more complicated than that, actually there's a completely different way you can look at it. But it means being able, first of all, to read sources in other languages, which is, which is not easy, and also being allowed to go and follow your nose. And one of the great problems I think we have in academia now is pressure to produce on time. Mm-hmm. And fruit ripens at its own pace. I think probably this is a book that is my kind of masterpiece, I guess. I can't believe I'll write anything on that scale again. But it's the kind of book I should have written when I'm 80. And highly distinguished with a big white beard, and quite often academics who get to that, but they die before they publish it. And it sits on their desk 800 pages and no one gets anywhere. It just so happened that this particular fruit happened to ripen at the right kind of moment. And in fact, my luck, I think, it was as well as it being the right moment to write it, it was the right moment for it to come out.
Could you talk a little bit about the mechanics of actually getting a publisher, finding an agent? How was that? You already had published one book, but did this project flow from very naturally? Was it a sort of a complete idea when you took it to your agent and the publishers?
No, I won my agent by fluke, by complete chance. We are, my wife particularly is a first-class citizen. She always wants to try and help local communities and so on. She's very engaged, and this evening knocking on doors, canvassing for the election. She's very committed, and we were trying to help support a local museum that's aimed particularly at children in Oxford, which is much, much harder to raise money for than you might think. People always say they'll help and then they don't. And sometimes you have to put your money in your pocket, hand in your pocket rather, to find the money. And we were supposed to go to, I think, a drinks party that we had something in London. And so she, without telling me, bid for 3 or 4 things in the silent auction, one of which was a consultation with a literary agent. And we got home the next day and got rung up saying, you didn't win the other ones, but you won the consultation with a literary agent. So I rang Catherine Clark, who became my agent, and she said, look, I don't know who you are, but can we meet in a public place where there are witnesses in case you're whatever? And I said to her, look, number one, I'm not a writer who thinks I've got a best-selling novel in me. I've been around the block enough times to understand that no matter how brilliant a book is I write about, whatever it is, people aren't interested in that. They're interested in tank battles in Germany in the Second World War. They're interested in the stuff that we know about. And she listened patiently, and I explained that my thesis and the stuff I worked on first, the text I translated for Penguin Classics, called the Alexiad by Anna Komnina, was the first narrative history written in the European language by a woman. And it's been overlooked for 1,000 years, more or less, because it has her name on the front cover. People don't take it seriously, which has its own interesting dynamic. And so she said, well, rather than, she said, where are you on the, you're writing a book about it? I said, well, I'm on about page 900 for a massive book that's going to completely change how we think about whatever. And she said, look, it sounds quite interesting. Do you think you could write me a sort of couple of pages about what it's about that doesn't ideally burst into Bulgarian or quote weird sources, but just say why that's important? And then she said, look, this sounds to me great. It sounds that there's a new story to tell. And I sat down with her after it came out and I said, I'm never going to write anything that good again. And she said, well, that's fine. If you don't want, it's all, I'm not going to force you to do anything, but why don't we have lunch? And she said, what would you think of writing next? And I said, I don't think I can ever write anything that good. And then she came back for lunch again a few months later. And I said, okay, look, I think that there's something important to say about how we look at the world, and that chunk in the middle, not the East. There's lots of books about the rise of China and is it good? Well, no one writes and says it's good right here in the West. We're threatened by it. There's more and more being written about South Asia and India, but really no one is interested in Iran or the Middle East, apart from in terms of conflict, and certainly no one's interested in looking at the interactions between the Russian-speaking world, Central Asia, and so on. And I said, I think there's something exciting and whatever that I think I can write. And she said, well, what period would it be? And I said, well, I'd probably stop it about the time that Europe rises, because that's kind of where the story starts to become more about how the West produced the scholars and the scientists and the artists and so on, which is not entirely correct, but broadly speaking true. I think if you could pick where you could have lived for the last 300 years in the world, you'd be quite hard to beat London, quite hard to beat in the last 150 years New York, I suppose. But that wouldn't have been the case for the last 2,000 years. And she said, look, that sounds interesting. Why don't you go and write a proposal? And I kept saying to her, look, I don't want to write something for the sake of it. And she said, I'm not going to, you just, whatever. And then what always happens when there's a moment of doubt, you need someone whose judgment you trust, who says, this sounds great. And so I showed my wife, first of all, and she said, that looks really exciting. And even she didn't know some of the stuff that I thought would fit in. And then Catherine said, look, let me talk to a few people. And my publisher who published the First Crusade book said they thought it couldn't be done. They thought it was too ambitious and it was unwritable and people wouldn't read it. All the stuff that's in that book, the stuff on Soviet history in the 20th century was first worked on at Cambridge in the early 90s. And then you've got to bring things up to date. But you already those ideas about what were the Soviets doing in Afghanistan, why now? You know what kind of questions to ask. So there were lots of bits of it that have taken a long time to come together. The origins of Islam, the writing of the Quran, is something that I've been sitting on seminars, giving seminars, talking for 20 years. So there were lots of different strands all coming together. There was part of me that didn't expect anybody would say yes. Mm-hmm. I thought it was, and particularly when my original publisher, who always gets the first dibs, said, look, just forget it. I thought, in a funny way, I was quite relieved. I thought, thank God I'm not going to have to write that book. All of this. Because I write my proposals, and everyone does things slightly differently. I quite like quite a chunky proposal, so it's sort of 25 pages long. Mm-hmm. It explains in a lot of detail what topics and so on. And then there was a sort of flurry of interest of a few people getting excited, including Peter Carson, who was a great Russianist. He was a translator of Chekhov, and he'd been my editor when I translated the Alexiad, and I trusted his judgment. And he sent me a very nice letter saying, I wish that we could publish it, but we can't afford to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Which, people don't pay large amounts of money for history books as advances, as I think as most people know. But then Michael Fishwick at Bloomsbury got it, and he called me in, and I saw him. My proposal was then. There were pencil marks all over it, which is normally quite a good sign or quite a bad sign. And he said, "Look, this is extraordinary. I've never heard any of this stuff about slaves from Venice, being exported to the Middle East. I've never heard any of this stuff about how the Silk Roads after the rise of Europe are still pumping and thrive, how the connections of silver flows from the Americas to India. And he kind of looked me up and down and said, look, I understand that you can get the classical world right and the middle bit, but can you really do the modern bit, the last 200 years? Is that really what you do? Have you got the competence? Do you know how to do that? And I said, well, look, number one, that's kind of, I rehashed the stuff I'd done in Russia and the Arabic world and said, once you study that stuff, you're always reading, you're always keeping an eye out. And, I'm quite omnivorous outside the Byzantine world, because not that much is being written by my colleagues, I guess, to stay in touch. And he sort of paused. I could see, he looked at me, and I think he was, I could see him thinking, is this guy actually going to manage to do it? And funnily enough, now compare, and then when he said, then he sort of, they came and said they'll take it on, and that book is the exact book that my proposal set out to write. In the right chapter structure, the ideas are all there. Some of it's more detailed, but there's nothing that I'd left out of it. And so, although I hadn't started to write it before my publisher said yes, it was like a microwave meal, ready to go in.
Obviously all there. All the
yeah,
ideas
and it was kind of, that's my life's work. And if he'd said no, then I'd have parked it and I'd have come back to it in 25 years' time.
I'm not a historian by training, but I sense that in academic history that this is the way that careers are made, that you turn received wisdom on its head. And I suppose, playing devil's advocate here, did you feel that the places you were looking, the lines of argument, was that very much led by the evidence, or did you have a sense like, I want to shake the branches a bit here? Which way round did it go?
No, I think that there are people who are specifically provocative, and I think that's a trait that is very heavily encouraged in journalism, where you need to have a position, and the more extreme your position is, the more bankable you are, right? That's why we get Nigel Farage on the news every night. That's why we get these extremes, and that's why we have politics in crisis right now, because any normal sane person would want to hear both sides of the argument and end up somewhere in the middle. And I'd have thought most of the country is probably thinking, look, Brexit is going to be a disaster, but let's go with it. Or they're thinking the European Union has got lots of, but we're able to listen to both sides and pick out the best of both. But we live in this polarised world. And I think that for sure there are academics and there are historians. I don't know what a trained historian is, like you said. But, you can do that. I think with something like this, I'm not trying to say what other people have done wrong. There's no school settling, like I said. It's just, this is how history looks to me. Sure. And this is where the material is. Here's the evidence. And Lisa Jardine, the great Lisa Jardine, who is a friend and a mentor of both mine and my wife's, she said, she was very involved in the scientific world, and she said, scientists never prove anything. You just overwhelm with evidence, right? And I think that's what this book here does. I'm not trying to say, discard your theories, jump on board the Silk Road bus. It's to say, this is what's here, this is what it looks like, and that needs to be incorporated, however you choose to view it or whatever. So and I'm not interested in making a name for myself off the back of some two-bit petty argument that tries to take people on and fight with them. I think it's not that, and those of you who read it know it's not that kind of book, because who is there to fight anyway when you're talking about the 7th century and the Abbasid revolution in the 750s? There are not many people who are going to come out fighting.
Do you feel you had a kind of personal association, or given your family's background, did you feel that this was something that was kind of part of your own heritage as an individual and as a writer?
I think in terms of what mattered growing up was that I came back from the classroom where I'd been learning about the Battle of Hastings and Henry VIII and the Battle of Waterloo and the First World War, and I'd switch on Newsround and I'd see Soviet missiles being deployed to Eastern Germany, and I'd see the Iranian embassy in London having its windows blown out, and I'd see Vietnamese boat people, and I'd see the Khmer Rouge on the TV, and I'd see the PLO and Yasser Arafat, and I could never work out, when I was 7 years old, why was it that all the stuff that's front of the news is stuff about people and regions that I never ever hear about, and yet I'm being force-fed this diet that everybody knows anyway. And I think that there was a kind of awakening, I suppose, insofar as, well, who are these people who are going to murder us? why would the Soviets want to kill us all? What's their side of the story? Who is Ayatollah Khomeini? Is he all bad? And this black and white world in which we grew up, which I grew up in, I'm much older than all of you, most all of you as well, maybe one or two. That black and white certainty is something which makes people, again, that's part of the polemic of modern politics, that Trump is working in black and white, Brexit is black and white, and in fact even Remain for many people is in black and white. And it's that sort of trying to shade it and say, well, how do these positions look from other perspectives? And I think as a historian, that was much more important to me, to realise that there was this giant part of the world that we were disconnected from. Then when I was 18, it was Tiananmen Square in China changing dramatically. And to try to work out, well, why is this stuff being kept from me? And how do I go about trying to find out about it? And so that's all sort of folded itself into itself. And I think that's where Silk Roads has its kind of origins. And I was very, very lucky. I was lucky that the cover of the book is so fantastic. Mm-hmm. I was lucky that my editor, Michael Fishwick, left me alone. He didn't email me. In fact, I bumped into him after about 3 years at a drinks party. And he turned around after we commissioned the book, and he said, "I thought you might be dead." and I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I haven't heard from you. You haven't sent me anything. You haven't told me how you're getting on." And I said, "Look, I just want to stay in my cave, and when I'm ready, I'll come out." And lots of editors and lots of publishing houses, if they invest some money into the process, they need it's on a deadline and it's on a schedule. And the thing I'm most grateful for was being left to my own devices to write the book that I wanted. I was, I'm not kidding myself, the look of the book, the way it's produced. I had a fantastic copy editor, Peter James, who's absolutely wonderful, correcting my sort of, turns of phrases and so on, which is hugely important because there's nothing worse than tripping over the, in fact, when I was told you use this expression 42 times in the book, and I said, I can't remember what expression it was, I said, there's absolutely no way I've used it more than 5 times, I'll bet you a beer. And lo and behold, you don't recognise your own nervous tics. Yeah. And all authors will, if they're honest, we all get slightly snowblind because at the end of it, as the book comes to an end, you kind of want it to be done. Yeah. It'd be like having a baby, you kind of want it out. You don't really care. And you're convinced that it's as good as it can be. So having a kind of team that, so Peter James, who was a fantastic copy editor. And then I just was unbelievably lucky that as I was kind of in the dying stages of it, through, I can promise you, no skill of mine, it just so happened that President Xi turned up in Astana in Kazakhstan and said, the people of Asia have always cooperated together, it's time for us to build a new set of Silk Roads. And that gave me a conclusion that was sort of building in the proposal because it was clear that Asia was kind of knitting together, but the fact that it became the kind of zeitgeist and the One Belt One Road initiative in China, here in England, we think it's every now and again it's on the front of the news, tucked in the newspaper that a train has arrived from China. Isn't that charming? I think we are totally unaware of the scale of change that's going on through Chinese investments across the spine of Asia right now. So it was incredibly lucky that worked. And as it happened, the moving parts of what's happening in Turkey, where today bookshops are being ransacked, Syria and Iraq, Iran, who knows whether they're going to come back into the family of nations or not, India, Pakistan and Kashmir, China and the South China Sea, North Korea, Russia and its great unknown interventions in the US elections and Ukraine. That entire world that this book is about is all up for grabs and it's all on the move. And, honestly, if we'd been talking 10 years ago, it would have been on the move in a slightly different way. Maybe there'd be more promising signs in some ways and different fragilities elsewhere. 30 years ago, it would have been the same story of what's going on with Turkey and NATO, the end of the Soviet Union. And the whole point is that those Silk Roads and those connections have always been where you should be standing to understand global history. But I was very lucky that timing worked. And that's probably, I think, why it has got not just a big readership here, but it's got a proper global readership. The Prime Minister of Turkey, the last Prime Minister of Turkey before Yildiz, stopped his motorcade in Waterstones a year ago and went into the Waterstones for half an hour, picked my book off the table and walked around the shop for half an hour looking at other books without taking any off the shelves, and then took out one, and I thought, okay, it better not be Tintin, or I took out another copy of my book and walked around with that, the entire wall-to-wall TV camera crews in Turkey, and then that's the only book he looked at, and then he left. And then the Turkish press went nuts saying, what is this book? And then some guy produced a video saying, here he is in the bookshop in Istanbul last week doing exactly the same thing with the same book. And I can't make that stuff. You can't make that stuff up. It just kind of caught fire. And the truth is, a lot of that is then you get asked to come and give talks, and time is very precious. But it's a joy for me to to come here. These guys, they're not paying me to be here, as far as I know, right?
One thing that we try and do with these events and the podcast is to talk as frankly as we can about money and about some of the financial issues involved in writing, and disclose as much or as little as you want to with here. But I mean, are you presumably your kind of income has historically come from academic jobs rather than from writing, and do you see that perhaps changing going forward with the success of this? Or?
No, I think if I'm being really honest, that the mother lode in publishing is getting your book serialised. Okay, so when David Cameron's autobiography comes out, I'm going to guess that not that many copies will be sold, but it depends what he writes, obviously. But where he'll make a lot of money, where the money is the Telegraph or the Mail, I assume, will pay him a lot to get first dibs on the juicier stories, and that's how it works. If you can get a book that is picked up by the press, then that pays you properly. And I know people who have got high five figures for stuff that I can't quite understand how the economics of that work. But my book wasn't serialised by anybody, and in fact, I've written quite a lot for the press. I've written op-eds, and normally if I get asked to write one, I'll try and do it if I can, and particularly if it's something I'm interested in and have competence on. But that kind of helps. Although that some outlets pay okay, but you know that as well. Simon, it's particularly in this country, it's not it's quite hard to make a living out of that. I think that the sales of this book, which has been a big bestseller, it's a big income. It's a big income as opposed to zero, but it's not life changing. It's not at a scale where you feel that you can down tools. But I've had look, but boats aren't very expensive in Oxford. You can buy a barge for a couple of £1,000. Probably catches fire when the students get their hands on it. So it's also quite hard to tell because foreign sales, they only pay in once a year. So they haven't done that yet for this year. So I've got no idea. So in Holland, it's been in the top 10 for months and months and months, and there they sell for €50 a copy, which is a lot. And I've got no idea what that's going to represent in terms of what drops in. So the Dutch paid me, I think, €7,000 or something for my rights. And if my maths is right, I should get a lot more than that.
And what's the next project? Do you have one in mind?
Yeah, I've got sort of a few I suppose like an air traffic controller. That's a kind of super jumbo. It's a monster big book. I do have one big super jumbo in the sky. That's a big book about Russia that probably won't come in for. I don't think I'll finish writing it for 2 or 3 years. So that won't come out for a while. But then I've got sort of a couple of smaller planes that it just needs the wind conditions to be right. And, at the moment, I said when I sat down, I've taken 50 flights this year. And I'm quite a committed environmentalist, and flying, I think, is, it's not the worst thing in the world, but, it's not great. But I've also been dragged into a world which is more interesting. I didn't write the book to make money, and I'm thrilled that it's done well. I'm thrilled for my publisher above all, and I'm thrilled for other historians that serious history can find an audience. And I think in this world of doom and gloom, it's terrific to know that serious history, that pick a chapter, that it can get away. It's terrific for all of us non-fiction writers. But what is very interesting is that what access it's given as a result, and what kind of things I've gone to go and talk at or give advice to or be asked my opinion about, where, I don't, all this stuff, like I said, I've been doing this since I was 7. No one was that interested 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, and now, now people really want to know what you think. And what's interesting, I think is I've tried to stay off TV. I'm not doing this to become recognised or famous or whatever. Despite writing an ambitious book called The New History of the World, I'm very down to earth and very modest. I don't want to have any personal glory. And my real thrill is the excitement of discovery, and then the second excitement of introducing what I've discovered. And like show and tell at school, that was the best day you ever had, and because you got a chance to show it off. But it's been a global. I never thought I'd say that about a book that a Byzantine historian would write, but it has become a kind of global phenomenon.
We've actually now got sort of 4 quite nice questions for you. Exactly MacLeod Pinsett wanted to know if there was a time that you could go back to on the whole scope of the Silk Road. When would it be, and why would you choose that time if you could go back to it?
Okay, well, I have been to the dentist today, right? So I need somewhere which has good, decent dental care, because I think when you read dental guidebooks from 300 years ago or 1,000 years ago, any medical text, you should be rightly grateful that we live in the day and age that we do. The smarty pants answer to the question is that if you went back anywhere in history, as long as you could be male and rich, it doesn't matter. I think if you go back in time and you're poor, life is hell, and if you're a woman, almost certainly it's hell. So I think being a rich man, then you can drop me back anywhere you like.
Okay. Ananetta Russi wanted to know that given this book's scope, has it altered your opinion on Britain and the EU?
The honest answer is you pay the price. If you can't guess when you come to dealing with other people. If you rely on your gut instinct rather than your brains, you might as well toss a coin. And I think that when we look at Putin, when we look at Turkey, when we look at Iran, by and large, people I know who should know better don't know what they're talking about. It's all what they read in that day's newspapers. Putin looks like a joker, so therefore we can't like him. Rather than work out, is that actually correct in the first instance? Is he a sort of super powerful overlord? Or is he propped up by a whole bunch of competing interests that can't think of anybody better to replace him, and in fact he's extremely weak? If you guess and you rely on your instincts, that's what, like, my dog does that, right? So we have a real problem with education where if we don't study other people and other people's cultures, other people's histories, their languages, what matters to them, there's a price to pay. And the Brits were better at doing that in the past than they are today. I think that whatever the post-Brexit world is going to look like, I'd want people who are multilingual, well-travelled, open to different cultural influences, and are engaged with other parts of the world. And that doesn't look to me the profile of our chief Brexiteers, who look ultra-English and have a very particular view of what they think British history looks like. So it hasn't really changed, I think, my view of Britain. I mean, for what it's worth, empires when they die, or golden ages when they come to an end, it's always about a periphery that breaks off. And that's what Britain looks like it's doing. We think it's a logical thing that with the Titanic sinking, we might as well take a chance of jumping in the icy water. My view is that Europe's time in the sun is over anyway, and actually we're just going to accelerate that in Britain's case. And the question is, what happens next?
So hello, it's us again with a quick update from our lives. Kassia, what have you been up to this week?
I just got off the plane this morning from a brilliant and very energising trip to San Francisco, where I was interviewing the CEO of a company for the final chapter of the book that I'm writing now, which is incredibly exciting. And I got to see a beautiful San Franciscan startup office, which was gorgeous and good fun.
Fantastic. I've had a busy week. I was here in London. I had a big piece come out last Thursday about Patrick Ekeng, a footballer who died in tragic and mysterious circumstances in Romania. I'm taking another big magazine story for Business Week through its final stages and preparing to go to Russia for an assignment next week. So lots going on in our lives. Great to have you with us, and we look forward to having you here next time. Thanks.
Like all writers, we love feedback, so do please find us on social media. On Facebook, you can just search for us at Always Take Notes.
On Twitter, we're at Take Notes Always.
And we're also on Instagram.
And if you've enjoyed the show, we'd love if you could leave a review on iTunes.
That really helps.
This episode of Always Take Notes was produced by Olivia Cralin, Ed Kiernan and Liz Davies.
Music was by Jess Danheiser.
And we've been your hosts, Simon Acombe
and Kassia Sinclair. Thank you so much for joining us, and we can't wait to have you back with us next time.